From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Psychiatry Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Psychiatry.
Welcome to the JAMA Psychiatry Author Interview Podcast. I'm your host and web editor, Dr. John Torous. Today we're thrilled to be discussing a new paper just out in JAMA Psychiatry, Trajectories of Adolescent Media Use and Their Association with Psychotic Experiences. We're about to be joined by the first and senior authors of the paper, Dr. Vincent Paquin and Shah, both MDs at the Department of Psychiatry, McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Media use in mental health has quickly emerged as one of the most discussed topics in 2024. Around the world, we're seeing new lawsuits, regulation, and policies designed to protect youth from perceived harms from screen time and media use. But the research around these harms is actually very mixed, with some work suggesting benefit, others no effect, and others, of course, some harm from media exposure in youth. Yet one population that we know even less about is for youth with psychotic experiences. Like other youth, these people are online, they're using media today, but what do we know about the effect of digital media, and is it hurting them today, or is it going to hurt them in the future? To find out, we explored the results in a brand new study just out in JAMA Psychiatry. So thank you for joining us, both Dr. Paquin and Dr. Shah. So I want to jump in with a question for Dr. Paquin. Media use in mental health is on everyone's mind. Why has this topic become so important in recent years, and especially today?
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I think one of the reasons that this topic has become so important and so commonly discussed is because the use of digital media has really increased in the last decade. Nowadays, most youth have a smartphone and have a social media profile, and parents see their children spending many hours every day on screen-based devices, and they wonder, what are the potential impacts for the mental health of our children? How is this going to affect their social and emotional development? And at the same time, there have been some experts who have suggested that maybe digital media could be responsible to some extent for the increased prevalence of mental health and academic difficulties among young people. And indeed, as you mentioned, some studies have found associations between screen time or digital media use and mental health problems in youth, and other studies have suggested potential benefits for mental health, including through possibilities of obtaining social support, accessing information, or simply for self-expression, identity exploration, and so on.
So it really is a mixed picture. There could be some benefit, there could be some potential harm, and there's more to learn. But I think my next question relates to that for Dr. Shah. Lots of populations have been studied around media use and mental health, but there's been less research on youth who have psychotic experiences. What exactly are psychotic experiences, and are these different than, say, psychosis?
So, in comparison to psychotic symptoms, what we think of as psychotic experiences is that they are relatively mild and perhaps transient. So things like hearing one's name called sporadically or during periods of stress, or sometimes with odd beliefs about superstitions that emerge or creep in without much in the way of functional impairment. Now, we contrast these psychotic experiences with more classical symptoms of psychosis like persistent hallucinations or delusions or negative symptoms, which we more commonly think of as being associated with severe or profound functional impairment. There is, a sense that about 2 to 3% of people over their lifetime would experience psychotic level symptoms. But in fact, one of the things we know now is that a larger proportion, maybe even over 10% of the population, will have experienced psychotic experiences of some sort at one point or another over their lifespan. But at all levels of severity, we increasingly think and believe that psychotic symptoms and experiences are indicators of higher levels of other experiences or dimensions, things like anxiety or low mood or sleep disturbances. And perhaps importantly, we also are beginning to understand that psychotic experiences are associated too with functional impairment over time, so that even if individuals who've had psychotic experiences do not go on to developing a fully formed psychosis, they might still have some level of functional impairment compared to a control or comparator population.
So now that we understand that media could have some impact on mental health, and Dr. Shah has helped us understand what psychotic experiences are and how common they are, why do we think there could be a potential link between media exposure and psychotic experiences?
In theory, there are many potential mechanisms that could connect media use and psychotic experiences. For example, you can think about the social possibilities of media, which range from exposure to online social support, which is potentially good for mental health, to experiences like cyberbullying or online experiences of social exclusion. And so these kinds of exposures may be related to more negative mental health outcomes. You can also think about the lifestyle ramifications of media use. For example, some research suggests that excessive screen time might disrupt sleep before bedtime, whereas reading a book, which is another form of media use, could facilitate the transition to sleep. And so these are all different mechanisms that may influence mental health in general and also psychotic experiences, which often share many common pathways with other mental health outcomes. And then another possibility is that media use could be an indirect marker of risk, because we know that psychotic experiences and higher levels of media use share many risk factors. So some studies have shown that they are both associated with parental mental health problems, loneliness, bullying, and parent-child relational problems. And these are important to consider because it's also possible that if a young person with psychotic experiences reports greater media use, it might just be a reflection of these predisposing factors.
And given there's so many potential associations between media use and having these common psychotic experiences, Dr. Shah, what did we know before your team and you guys undertook the study? What was kind of the leading research or hypotheses around what could be happening here?
Right. So there have been a few studies, primarily in the US and Asia, which have found cross-sectional associations between things like internet addiction and psychotic experiences, and really with a focus on children and young adults in these studies. There was one study of college students from Taiwan, which found that higher levels of paranoid ideation were associated with internet addiction at 1 year of follow-up. However, of course, internet addiction is perhaps different than simply measuring the time spent on the internet or on media activities. Addiction implies something else, including functional impairment or distress. And these factors can themselves amplify the association with other mental health problems. Now, it turns out that a previous study, actually led by Dr. Paquin and in collaboration with another colleague of ours at McGill University, Dr. Marie-Claude Geoffroy, has followed a sample of young adults over about 6 months, and they measured digital media use, things like watching videos, using social media, playing video games, over 3 time points. And in that study, our team found that higher levels of digital media use were cross-sectionally, but not prospectively, associated with more psychotic experiences. So these results then suggested that really it's necessary to look at previous trajectories of media use, for example, through adolescence, and potential confounders associated with this, to better understand why there may be a shared propensity for media use and psychotic experiences in adulthood.
And to address that limitation of cross-sectional research, your team used a very interesting data set. The people partaking came from the Quebec longitudinal study of child development. Tell us about this cohort and why was it ideal for your research, and how long of a data frame were you taking from this cohort?
This is really a unique data set. It's a population-based cohort of children born in the province of Quebec in Canada in 1997-1998. And these children were followed from the age of 5 months to the present. So the study is still ongoing. And during the study, there has been measures collected every 1 to 2 years, including reports from the children themselves, from the parents, and sometimes from the teachers. So we have data from multiple informants at multiple time points and spanning many domains of these children's lives and development, including their mental health, their social and familial relationships, and their functioning.
And in this study, this may be a question for Dr. Shah, how did you record media use? Because clearly what was hip and new in 1997 is not there. Say smartphone technology may be more prevalent. So what does media use mean in this study?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So we'll get to the smartphone use in just a moment. But in the data set, what we had done was participants reported their use of media at 4 specific time points, those being ages 12, 13, 15, and 17. And at those time points, individuals were asked about 4 specific types of media use: television viewing, console-based video gaming, computer use, and reading. And there they reported how much time they spent on each of these 4 activities on a weekly basis. Now, given your initial question, you'll note that smartphone use was not actually included, largely as a function of the time during which the data collection was happening. And that's indeed a limitation that we do go on to discuss in the paper.
Understanding then kind of how we recorded media use, how do we record psychotic experiences in the study? Because that's the association we're looking for between these two.
Yes, so media use was measured between 2010 and 2015, where the participants were adolescents, and psychotic experiences was measured in 2021, when the participants were 23 years old. To measure psychotic experiences, we used a self-report questionnaire called the 15-item Community Assessment of Psychic Experiences, sometimes called the CAPE. And this questionnaire looks at different types of psychotic experiences, including ideas of persecution, bizarre experiences, and abnormal perceptual experiences. And each item looks at the frequency of each experience. And this gives us a score on a continuous scale that captures the lifetime occurrence of psychotic experiences overall.
Thank you both. It's easy to understand what the question is, what we're setting up. We're measuring media use, we're measuring psychotic experiences. So, Dr. Shah, let's talk about the actual cohort. You have this Quebec longitudinal study of child development. What does the final sample look like that you're including?
Right. So of that larger initial cohort that Dr. Paquin mentioned, we restricted these analyses to 1,226 participants. That's about 58% of the total sample. And these were individuals who had completed the assessment of psychic experiences, the CAPE, at any previous point in time at age 23, with at least one assessment of media use during any or more than one of those 4 time points during adolescence. In that sample of 1,226 individuals, 58% were female based on sex assigned at birth, 93% were white, and relative to the participants who'd been excluded from the analysis due to missing information, the analytic sample featured greater proportions of female participants, and households with low income had mothers who were more educated, more highly educated, and it underrepresented racialized minority groups.
Still, to get a sample over that many years is very rare and unique. But I think perhaps the question that everyone wants to know is, what were the main results around media use in these trajectories?
We started by looking at the trajectories of media use to try to describe groups of participants who had a similar pattern of media use over time. And we found 3 trajectory-based groups across each type of media. So for TV viewing, we found lower, medium, and higher trajectories of use. We found the same thing for video gaming and for reading. And for computer use, we found a trajectory of lower use, one of curved use, characterized by increasing, then decreasing levels of use over time, and also a trajectory of higher use. Across these four types of media, most adolescents were in the trajectories of lower use, but there were about 10 to 30 participants that were in each of the other trajectories. So after we looked at these trajectories, we wanted to see whether there were any childhood or family characteristics that predicted the trajectories of media use during adolescence. And for one trajectory in particular, there were a number of associations that emerged. And this was for the higher video gaming trajectory. We found that in this group, there were more participants who were male, who were from households with lower income, who reported higher levels of computer use and video gaming in childhood before adolescence. And there were also higher levels of depression, anxiety, hyperactivity in attention, bullying, and lower levels of quality of friendship and supportive parenting at 12 years of age. So in summary, for this higher video gaming trajectory, there were some indicators that suggested more socio-environmental adversity.
And of course, you were looking at psychotic experiences, and as Dr. Shah told us, these can be common up to 10% of the population, perhaps. So maybe it could help us understand what were those results between media use and psychotic experiences in this cohort.
I want to start by mentioning that to make this comparison, we took the lower trajectories of use as the comparators because these were the groups that comprised the most participants. And so we wanted to see whether the medium, curved, or higher trajectories were associated with more psychotic experiences relative to the lower trajectories of media use. And we looked at two types of models, unadjusted and adjusted models, including covariates such as childhood and family characteristics. First, we found that TV viewing and reading were not associated with any difference in psychotic experiences by age 23 across trajectories. But then for the higher trajectory of video gaming, we found that participants reported about 7% higher levels of psychotic experiences by age 23. However, this association really disappeared after adjusting for mental health and interpersonal difficulties at age 12, suggesting that these previous factors might actually confound the association between higher video gaming and psychotic experiences. And finally, we found that the curved trajectory of computer use was also associated with more psychotic experiences, about 4 to 5% more. And this was independently of previous mental health or interpersonal difficulties.
These are very interesting results. And for those of you who can find the paper, the figures are very interesting too in the tables to see more details. And again, it's hard to go over every figure in detail, but maybe one more question is, in the discussion, you note that these results have to be interpreted, and you kind of elaborated already in light of some of the timing or context or socioeconomic parts. Maybe if you can emphasize, though, just so how readers can understand how you would want them to understand the results.
I want to highlight two things. The first is about the finding of an association between higher video gaming and psychotic experiences. I think it's really important to look at the potential confounding influence of childhood factors like mental health problems and interpersonal difficulties. We think that this may be because adolescents facing various forms of socio-environmental adversity may turn to video games as a coping strategy, for example, or because it is perceived as a safer or more accessible activity in their environment. And there is actually evidence that video games can help with emotion regulation and self-determination. And this is important to consider because the same socio-environmental adversity that drives some people towards gaming may also predispose them to psychotic experiences. In other words, it might confound the association between higher video gaming and psychotic experiences. The other point I want to highlight is that for the association between the curved trajectory of computer use and psychotic experiences, we think that the shape of the trajectory provides some important clues about the mechanism of association. Okay, let's assume that there were a dose-response relationship between computer use and psychotic experiences. we would have expected to find that the higher the trajectory of usage, the higher the level of psychotic experiences by adulthood. But this is not what we found. There were no differences between the higher and lower trajectories. It was the curved trajectory that predicted more psychotic experiences. And then we think during those years and during adolescence, most people reported an increase in their computer use, even in the trajectory of lower use. And so it might be normative during this period to spend increasing amount of time on technology, both for historical and maybe also for developmental reasons. You can think, for example, about academic requirements to do certain homework on a computer. And so maybe for these participants who reported decreasing usage after age 15, there might be something atypical about this pattern that could suggest that something else is going on. It could be various factors, and this is our interpretation, okay? It could be the onset of psychotic experiences, the onset of functional impairment, or other potential confounders like interpersonal conflicts or substance use.
But I think it's a testament to the rigor of your methods that you allow us to even think about these questions, because the prior cross-sectional research really didn't even allow us to talk about these or understand it, what's happening. I think that's what makes this research so fascinating and groundbreaking. And this next question is for Dr. Shah. For, say, any parents or young people listening to the podcast, how would you want them to interpret the findings? Clearly, you're not saying that any technology use is going to be bad or forbidden by you two.
Right. So we're certainly not going to say that everybody should shut down digital media use, right? Not only is it practically very difficult, but one way to think about it is that our findings may actually be a little bit reassuring. They do not provide or offer evidence that media use in adolescence is a significant risk factor for psychotic experiences, right? Even in that curved trajectory of computer use that Dr. Paquin was mentioning, for which the association wasn't fully explained by the other covariates, the association with psychotic experiences was actually quite small, only 3 to 4%, which in actuality is less than 1 point difference on the original scale. Now, having said that, we also want to recognize that it is critical to stay mindful of keeping a balance with other important factors that contribute to mental health and well-being, things like in-person social interaction, physical activity, sleep, and so on. And for parents and young people, it's also important to understand that media technologies such as video games can bring positive elements, social connections, creativity, and so on. So there is a balance for which we need to learn more about through studies such as this and maybe what this generates, and also sort of learn more about in order to figure out how best to implement changes.
Certainly having results like this will help evolve the discussion in the right way. And perhaps we have time for one final question. How would you want clinicians and policymakers to perhaps act on these interesting results? We know there's a lot of discussion in those circles as well.
Yes, I think for clinicians and policymakers, the key is really to avoid assuming that media technologies are all bad for adolescents, and instead to acknowledge that there are potential benefits depending on the person's context and the way that they use technologies. And so we talked about video games, for example. A young person may be invested in video games as a preferred activity simply because they live in a neighborhood where outdoor activities don't feel as safe. And I think this kind of example illustrates why it's so important to seek to understand the specific context, the motivations, and the experiences surrounding media. Because this kind of tailored understanding will really allow clinicians and policymakers to make better recommendations. And to do that, we do need more research that provides more detailed assessments of technology contents and experiences, including from smartphones, social media, virtual reality, and so on. And we also need to consider how digital media can be leveraged to improve the accessibility and reach of services for young people. Because we saw in our study and elsewhere that people who have risk factors for mental health problems tend to report spending more time on technologies. So it might actually be an interesting avenue to better communicate and reach these populations.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude on, that there's a lot more work to do, but these results really are a huge step forward for the field to have it. So thank you both. So to conclude, again, I'm John Torous, and I've been speaking with Dr. Vincent Paquin and Jay Shah about their fantastic new paper, Trajectories of Adolescent Media Use and their Association with Psychotic Experiences. You can find a link to the article in the episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search JAMA Network anywhere you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at JAMA Network. Thanks for listening.